Hi, I'm Chris from airwindows, and I'm making this video because of a bunch of interesting stuff that's been going on with Patreon. I say Chris from airwindows because that's sort of my tagline. I am a audio software developer. As you might imagine, I do musical software, and I switched over to Patreon the beginning of last year, beginning in 2016. Specifically, it was 2/16/09 that it started to kick in. And the reason I'm talking to you is because I wanted to try to pitch in on the sort of new Patreon regime of calculations of things and hopefully come up with some answers and some explanations for why this might be happening. As you can see, I have been all kinds of busy doing facts and figures and calculations and stuff, and this is what I had in mind. A friend of mine who's also on Patreon, a poet named Jacoby, made a little post on Twitter when this sort of started to happen. And he said, why don't we just change the pledges around a little bit? In specific, I copied what he said. And he had an idea where he was going to change his pledges around and say his basic level was $1.60 and patrons would end up paying exactly $2. And there's a fan level. If you paid, if you pledged $4.50, patrons would actually pay $5. And then they had a collector's level, $9.35, and patrons would pay $10. Well, I thought it would be a good idea to work out some specifics on exactly what could be done with all of this. But I was also looking into the figures from what Patreon has been asking. And what I see is that over the last year or so, it's kind of worked backwards. In my first month, I did about $312 of pledges. And that might seem like a lot, but that's kind of part of what I'm going to be talking about here. Patreon really is kind of a payment processing service. I run airwindows. I was running airwindows on the payment processing service Kagi, formerly known as Kagi Shareware. And I'll tell you, they had fees too, but they were absolutely great about paying me checks and being honorable about that and not giving me any trouble up to the end when they went out of business because other people got a little bit too fancy and frisky with their promises and things. And Kagi ended up stiffing me for the last few $100s because they shut down. Patreon, on the other hand, has had venture capital jump up into their business in 2016. And one of the things that happened over the last year or so is when I started out at $312 of pledges, and that's not enough to live on, that was processed pledges, so my share was $272. There's always been a processing fee that they're calling a Patreon fee that was 5%. That's never changed. There's still a processing fee. It comes out of our side of things, and it seems like it must presumably be this fee, and it's always been 5%. That's not a change. The creators' share that they had in back then in 2016, I was getting 87% of what patrons gave me. And that left about, it says 7.8% processing fees. And that bounced around a little bit. I got up to $500, $600 or so dollars. And the processing fees increased to like around 9.7%, and it's hovered that way for some time. Then this September, something interesting happened. The creator's share dropped from 85% or so to 81, then 80.92, then 80.78, then 80.4. And this is after the venture capitalists jumped in. And the processing fees jumped rapidly to 13.99 to 14.08 to 14.21 to 14.59. You know, I think if they hadn't done anything and just continued quietly doing that, we'd all be in trouble anyway. So I'm not sure what's going on about that. Maybe that was just to make this change seem smoother. It shows up in my figures. If you look at your figures, you may see something very similar. Or not, because it's possible that that only affects people who get up above a certain threshold. I might myself be at the threshold that Patreon wants to consider, a serious creator with the possibility to have a life-changing experience. You probably read all of the stuff about that, all the articles about Patreon and the private things that their venture capitalists say to each other and stuff. But this is a picture of low-income patrons getting a screaming deal on the creator's share. And I'm pretty sure that was intentional. But there's been this thing about how Patreon is supposed to sort of take people up and all you do is join, and when you set up your thing, confetti goes off in the web browser and you get a little video from Jack Conte telling you how wonderful everything is going to be. And then apparently you become rich and famous. Well, no. I have made 3 Patreons. Only the current one was any good to me. Every single other one struck out completely, not even one pledge, because I was doing things that I wanted to do, or neat ideas that I thought would be amazing, rather than leveraging the stuff that I've been doing all along as my day job. Airwindows was my day job. I was selling plugins for $50 a piece, and they were Mac only too. But I did pretty well for myself for about 10 years. And my business, the plugin business, got affected by a lot of this same venture capitalist stuff and started going south, and I decided that what I wanted to do was come up with a way to just do my plugins as much or more as ever before, start doing them for PC as well, and give them away. And that is the big advantage of Patreon going forwards, including in this new situation. Patreon is recognized as a thing where you can give money to people who are being generous in some way, or perhaps even giving the stuff that they do away entirely. It's a recognized name. What they'd like to see is lots of people being super successful because of the whole exponential success curve thing. Internet virality basically means that pick a couple of people, they're going to be the successes, and everybody else can go and pound sand. That's fundamental to the way our culture operates. If Jack Conte wanted to fix that, he's going to have to try again, because Patreon's not going to do it. What Patreon is going to do is be a payment processor. They don't like the sound of that very much, but it is actually a very decent payment processor. I think they're probably a little more trustworthy than PayPal. I've had patrons going, "Oh, I can't deal with Patreon anymore. I'll just send you money by PayPal." And I go, "That's nice, and I won't stop you, but that'd be a really terrible idea for me to do." And PayPal is arguably a little less trustworthy. So my argument here is this, before I get into these things, which is how you can communicate with patrons honestly and essentially take on the new fees and stuff yourself by explaining everything outright and communicating every bit of the way that we all pretty much should be, the way that we want to be doing, but Patreon stepped away from that, and we have to do it now because they won't do it for us. The thing with Patreon is, since it's basically like a payment processor with a PR identity and a sort of common mood among patrons, the way we do is generally we do stuff on the internet and give it away for free or whatever. Some of us, like myself, wanted to lean heavily on small contributions just so that it would be sort of statistically more stable. And if you were trying to do something, you need to have customers first. Once you have customers, and once you have a revenue stream coming in that's substantial, like if you were doing a regular job by my figures, you'd have to make about 4 times as much as you can make on Patreon. But in so doing, you'll probably have to join the whole rat race of crazy marketing and everything like that. And I found it very distasteful and decided to do the free thing. if you can get into that zone where you are generating revenue and people are clamoring to give you money, Patreon's a perfectly serviceable way to do that. In fact, the changes they've put in have made it so that if you can get going with that sort of stuff, they will make it more worth your while to do better. It's like they're helping you catch on to this internet virality benevolence stream or whatever, which is basically a bunch of nonsense, but it does happen for some people, and that's luck. Jack with Pamplemousse, there's a lot of people who have done cover songs on the internet and can sing and play music, and he was lucky and ran with it, and when you get lucky, that's what you do. I'm somewhat lucky in that I managed to get up to, I've been hovering around $700 or so, which is one of my pledge levels. It means I'm putting out several different plugins from my old Kagi list of the boutique ones. And I'm seeing whether it goes anywhere. There's a reason why that is particularly of interest to me, but I'll get to that. I ran these figures on what you'd need to do, what you need to tell people in order to have them be billed a particular amount. And here's how you do it. It's kind of mathematical, so I was looking up stuff on the internet and bookkeeping things in order to start with a desired amount that a patron will pay, and then end up with the amount that your pledge level is. So you can tell them, pledge this amount and you will be billed this much. And then they will know what they're getting into. And that's completely fair and above board. Here's what you do. Start with your desired patron amount. And remember, they can't actually, they're not letting you do less than $1. I did run the math on that as well. I'll tell you how it is. First, subtract 35 cents. So you start with, say, $5. And you subtract 35 cents and it gives you $4.65. Then divide it, this number that you've got, because you're trying to get to what their mathematics will go back up to the desired patron amount that you're telling people is what they'll be charged. Divide it by 1.029. What this does is it makes it reduced to the point where if they add 2.9%, it goes back to what it was previously. We're doing an inverse thing. We're doing a thing where we start here and then they do the thing like add 2.9% and then add 35 cents of a fee, and then they'll charge the person what you wanted to be able to tell them. So you divide by 1.029, and that takes out what the 2.9% fee would do. And this is the part that I had to look up because it's a little bit arcane. And then have people pledge what you've got left. So if you start at 5, it'll go to 465, and then divided by 1.029 makes it 4.51. And if you tell people pledge $4.51, you'll be charged 5. They can pledge that much, and that's what they'll be charged. And what you'll get is 0.902 of what that pledge was. And Patreon's cut at the level of $5 would be 9.8%. Plus they'll also do the 5% that's been the same all along and has never changed. So that's how we do our math there. You can also calculate out Patreon's cut, as I did here. If you've got the cost that you're billing people, in this case $4.51, and you know that they're going to be paying $5, what you do is you take your billed cost divided by the target cost, and in this case it's 4.51 divided by 5. That got me the 0.902. And then 1 minus that 0.902 is 9.8%. Imagine this 0.902 is one would be 100%. And I ran the math on a bunch of this, so rather than droning on about that kind of stuff, I will start showing you what things would be. And again, work out the calculation with that. If you pledge $1, you'll pay $1.38. Patreon's cut will be 27.5%. That's substantial. That's larger than they currently take. They've been currently taking, I don't know, as much as 20% or so, but this is an increase. Now, if you pledge $1.60, you'll pay $2, and Patreon's cut becomes exactly 20%. So if everybody does that, then Patreon's situation is pretty much the same. Now, if you wanted to have people pay $3, you would have them pledge $2.57. Patreon's cut becomes 14.3%. If you'd like them to pay $4, you'd have them pledge $3.54. Patreon's cut becomes 11%. Notice the difference? Previously, in this other situation, we wound up having, a screaming hot deal for people who weren't making any money. And then as your income increased, the percentages and creator shares were dropping and dropping. They're doing it backwards. They're doing it so that as you do better, you wind up getting a lower Patreon cut. If you want people to pay $5, they'd pledge $4.51, and Patreon's cut would be 9.8%. If you'd like people to pay $10, assuming that they can get up to that point, there's some kind of high level, you'd have them pledge $9.37, and Patreon's cut becomes 6.3%. Now this is interesting. One of the reasons they're doing this, and this is a legit concern, kinda, sort of, depending upon who you are, is that without billing things individually, which does incur fees, that does become a thing, you'll get a situation where somebody's legitimately pledged and maybe you give them rewards or some special thing or whatever, and then they cancel it and they run away with your stuff. Now, I don't use Patreon that way. I use Patreon by giving people everything that I'm giving them, and it's up to them whether they feel that it's worth it to reward me for the work that I'm doing and keep me going, keeping me doing it. So I have no pledge levels at all, and I've really been kind of encouraging people to do dollar pledges, which is no longer feasible because the numbers just went crazy on me for doing that. I actually ran some figures on what I would be doing with, I sold my plugins for $50 a pop. So I've been telling people, you're getting an awfully good deal here because, $1 a month is $12 a year. And if you bought even one plugin a year, that would be $50. So I started running figures based on that. If somebody bought one plugin a year, they'd be spending about $50 a year. And $50 a year becomes charging people about $3.70 a month. So if they can do that, they're doing about $50 a year. And Patreon's cut is 11.1% at that point. If somebody was going to buy 2 plugins a year, that'd be $100. If somebody was game for spending $100 a year in what I do, they would be paying $7.75 a month. Patreon's cut becomes 6.9%. 3 plugins a year? Well, that's kind of a big deal. That would be if people were willing to pay $150 a year. And some did. Back when I was doing the commercial thing, some did. If they still did that, or if you never know, some people, I've had people become offended because they tried to pledge some kind of huge amount to get to a goal. And I said, can you please settle it down a little bit? Because I want to be beholden mostly to smaller pledgers. And that causes rich people to basically just quit Patreon in a rage. So beware. But if they were paying $150 a year, they would be billed $11.79 a month to get to that point. At that point, Patreon's cut is 5.6%. And it goes on. $200 a year would be $15.85 a month. $250 a year would be $19.89 a month. I know people who are doing subscription services in the back of numbers like that. And if you're doing subscription services in the back of numbers like that and billing $20 a month, Patreon's taken 4.5% plus the 5% that they are taking as that they've always done. $300, well, that's looking more like $23.94 a month, getting up into cable bill territory and stuff. And that's 4.23%. And just for laughs, I'm making these plugins, and they used to sell for $50 a pop, and that's just how that worked. And I've been doing them about every week. I've had to ramp up my activity an awful lot. If somebody was going to buy a separate plugin every single week, they were just a huge fan and they bought everything that I did and I put on a plugin every week, that'd be $2,599.48 a year. That would be $210.17 a month. I'm not asking anybody to do that, nor do I think would anybody else. And Patreon's cut becomes 2.98%. Less than 3% for Patreon if you did that. So that's basically how this works. Patreon has reversed their course, and rather than making a situation where they're helping out people with very low pledges and very small donations, they're setting it up so that they are making money on those small donations and discouraging people from leaning too heavily on that, because they're trying to get as many people as possible up into these highfalutin realms. And their goal for doing that is, one, they want to see people doing it so that they can advertise it. I think it's partly just get new people converting over to start using Patreon, perhaps in the belief that they will be like that, but Patreon won't help you do it. You have to have your revenue streams, you have to have your customers and your audience already there before you even talk to Patreon. It works like a payment processing system. That's all there is to it. But if you do have that, it becomes a pretty decent payment processing system, because they're working on the basis of a kind of incentive. If you're willing to get your stuff together and really scramble, and that's always been the way. Like, I'm pushing 50 years old and I've been working in the music business for a bunch of years. It's never really been any different. It's always been, scramble and get your gear together, fix your kit, put a lot of work in, put a lot of practice in. You don't get paid for any of that stuff. And then eventually, just like Jimi Hendrix, 10 years of dedicated rhythm and blues sideman, and he springs upon the scene and does Monterey Pop, and people go, "Oh, how did you become an overnight sensation?" Well, he was never an overnight sensation. He was a working rhythm and blues sideman for a decade. But to us, he seems like an overnight sensation because he sprang upon the scene and then everybody heard about him. And Patreon is fixing to be the payment processing system of the Jimi Hendrixes. That if you get hooked up to that kind of stuff and it starts to catch on, that's when you jump on Patreon. Because the way they've got things set up now, as long as you can do better, you do stuff that encourages people to throw more than $1 a month at you because they've stopped being the $1 a month people. If you can work out ways to do that, then it seems like a pretty decent payment processing system for that context. With that in mind, I think it's going to be pretty interesting again. Here is the formula for figuring out what to take a desired patron amount and turn it into the amount that you actually ask. That is, subtract the 35 cents, divide it by more than 1, divide it by 1.029, and then you have the number that you should be telling people to pay in order to get to the amount that you tell them you're going to be paying $5, and you tell them the figure that will put them there. And that's how that works. And this is the end results with that. We'll ignore the ones based on the $50 a month increments because that's more kind of my thing. And it's anybody's guess as to whether that's even going to work. I hope so. I do good work and I try to be helpful. I am not viral yet, but who knows? This is the math for what you do to get people to a particular amount. If they want 5, do 451. If you want to get to 10, have them pay 937. If you want to have them pay 2, then have them pledge $1.60. I did the math on what happens if they allowed people to pay $1. What would happen is you'd have to have them pledge 65 cents, and they won't let you pledge less than $1, but if they did, they would have you pledge 65 cents, and then their other stuff would jack it up to $1. And the amount of percentage that they would be taking is 36.9%. So we don't want that either. It is definitely not worth having people do $1 pledges, a whole universe of people who can only do that, and then have Patreon be taken close to 40%. It's more than a third out of everything that people are trying to give to artists. That's no good, so we'll just ignore that. They are right to limit it because it becomes just stupid. And I think actually that having people pledge $1 and pay $1.38 in order to have Patreon get a more than 1/4 cut of that is also kind of dumb. So it's really becoming more of a, sell more valuable things and get by on fewer patrons and stuff. Anybody who wants to operate on the like my way of doing this is very simply, if you can only afford $1, take everything that I've got. I want to help you. I don't want to take your money if you're poorer than me. It's really hard to be poorer than me. I've accumulated this stuff over the course of decades and built most of it. And, I'm not in great shape, but, I was able to tell my mom over the last year that I had started the Patreon when Kagi Shareware went out of business owing me money. And it grew from $312 or so up to consistently hovering around $700 or so. And I'm happy to be able to say that. And I'm also kind of happy that I'm not going to be able to tell her about this latest thing because my mom died last Wednesday night. And it makes for a real interesting holiday season, but my family is real tough and we're hanging in there. But while she was around, what Patreon had to offer gave her a sense that the stuff I was doing was working out for me and I was doing something that I believed in. And that's very true because before Patreon was a thing for me, I was trying to sell these plugins, these software products that I do, for $50 a pop in an environment where things were getting uglier and uglier and uglier. And you had to hype everything up like crazy and just about lie. And I was getting really unhappy with how that was working, and it was declining. It was going down because everybody was running out of money. And there was nothing much to that other than just try to weather it out. When the payment processor Kagi Shareware went out of business, I went heck with this, and I jumped on Patreon. And Patreon grew rather than shrinking. In the same time period, when everything was still going down, when everything was getting tougher and tougher, and I was giving my stuff away, and that made me happy, and Patreon was growing. Now they've got it set up to a place where if you are, like the 2 previous Patreon attempts that I made, if you have like 1 pledge and that's about it, and the only people that you know who connect to what you do only have $1, then Patreon isn't the best place for you. And they've more or less said that pretty directly. They're like, we would like to winnow out some of these people and focus on the ones who seem as if they would be able to grow up to become a life-changing experience. Well, I don't know if Patreon counts as a life-changing experience for me. My little $700 a month is already the top 3% or so of Patreon. It's certainly up in the top 4 or 5. And I don't know where it's going, but it does still make sense with what I do because I'm making these products that I used to sell for $50 a pop, and that gives me some wiggle room for talking to people and saying, okay, if you're as poor as me, pay nothing. I want to give you everything that I do. On the other hand, if you're a lot more well off than me, and you can afford something like that, I'll keep you busy with all kinds of products and I'll have lots of stuff for you to do. And in exchange for that, throw me $50 a year, maybe $100 a year, something like that. And I'll work it out so you know exactly what you're paying. And it'll be fair. I'm going the extra distance towards making it be fair so that we can tell people what they'll actually be paying. And in that context, I think Patreon is still a very good deal. They've never stiffed me or screwed with me in any kind of weird way, possibly excepting when the bean counters came in and jacked the processing fees up. But you know something? Where I'm at, I think they just went back down again. So go figure. Patreon does still have potential, but you can't look at it as the thing where you get on there, take $1 donations, and grow up from nothing. Because during my lifetime in the music business and a lot of other stuff that I've done, that's not how it happens. You grow up from nothing by just sort of scraping by somehow and staying committed to it, getting to a point where there's a bunch of people who are trying to throw money. That's when something like a payment processor comes into question. And that is where Patreon wants to kick in. And it seems like what they want to do is take people who already have those resources. They're not helping anybody who has nothing. That's not their role. But they're wanting to take people who have the resources to sort of go all the way with it and try to make their money kind of explode with this virality thing. And inherent in that is the fact that there's going to be worthy people who get left behind, because that just seems to be how this dynamic works. That just seems to be how this stuff goes. That a lot of people who should make some kind of living just won't. It's the mathematics of it. It's the virality of it. It's the fact that it's like a lottery and like one person gets lucky and wins and then they go, oh, I owe it all to myself. And then a lot of other people just catch a bad break or whatever, and something like Patreon isn't going to help them. So that's pretty much what I would say. Don't expect them to get you off the ground. With this recent change, they are actively deciding not to help people who are just getting started. That's not what they're about anymore. But they'd really like to see people who have some of their resources together and are getting by. I mean, like, I'm an interesting example of that, because $700, even, I'm up in Vermont, it's kind of cold out here at the moment. Even up in Vermont, in a obscure little town, $700 a month is not a lot to live on. But it's a start, and it's already up to the 3% or so of all Patreon, everybody out there. I don't really have much more to say about that, as you can imagine what with, what I told you about my mom and stuff. It's been a difficult week, and Patreon's decisions have made it even more interesting. But the way I live my life and the way my mom wanted to see me live my life was, as things happen, I try to pitch in and help. So this is me trying to tell you, firstly, what you can do in order to build people on your Patreon, tell them what to expect, and be honest with them, which I think is primarily important. Freeze frame on this if you need to read it. Tell people how to pick any particular number that they want to tell people they'll be paying, and then come up with a pledge level that will reach that in the end. And lastly, speak up just a little bit for the Patreon people who have been in a tricky kind of situation of having made promises. Their promises, their eyes are bigger than their stomachs. Their promises were bigger than the reality. Because the reality is, they can set up a thing where people can pledge $1 to a person who's drawn like 3 pictures or something like that and only rates $1. And that's not going to help that person go to the point where they're making $1,000 or $10,000. They won't be helping with that. And it's kind of false pretenses to imply that they'll be helping with that, or set off confetti in the web browser when you've made your thing to make you feel as if you've done something very special. But they never were able to do that in the first place. Maybe they thought they did. Maybe they just, it seemed good in Silicon Valley. Jack Conte's from San Francisco, so it's all, it's legit enough. It's earnest enough. But it was never going to happen that way. And what they're doing is capable of making some things happen in some kinds of ways. So I'd still recommend it. I would still recommend Patreon if you have your ducks in a row. And if you're running whatever your creative pursuit is as a business and you have customers. If you have customers already, it makes sense. I did, so that's what I'm doing. And I'm going to be staying with Patreon. I hope it grows. It seems as if they're cutting me a slightly better deal now because I've gotten up to around $700 or so. And I don't even know what's in store for the future. But, Patreon's handling, $10 million or something like that. They may have a bunch of venture capitalists on board, but they're functioning like something like a PayPal or whatever. They're functioning like a big internet backbone type of thing, and they're still associated with people who are giving their work away generously for free and just looking for patronage to support them doing the stuff that they love. That's their brand. Their brand isn't really rescuing people from only being able to earn $1 because they never did, and they never will. But their brand is associated with people who are trying to give stuff. I mean, if my Patreon grows to a certain point, that's actually $800, I'll start open sourcing everything I've ever done. And I'm eagerly awaiting that because I'm very enthusiastic about sort of getting one in on the audio software industry, which I feel has become kind of untrustworthy, and I have issues with it. So I like the idea of putting tools in the hands of people. And I think that is a great partnership with what Patreon is and what Patreon does. Because it's not so much about just, I draw pretty pictures, but help me dedicate my life to this thing that will put tools in lots of people's hands. Somebody should make a Patreon for doing the successor to Patreon that is going to help the people who are getting paid $1 from like one patron and stuff. Somebody should do a Patreon for that. I'd probably join it. Anyhow, I have been Chris from airwindows. I'll keep plugging away through our difficult holiday season. Thanks a lot to Patreon, but these things happen, and it's how you handle it. And whoever you are, you're probably some Patreon adjacent person to be watching this and sticking through all of this long talk and all of these facts and figures and things. I hope you have a good holiday season too, and I hope this doesn't throw you for too much of a loop. I think pretty much the chances of making it through Patreon or becoming an artist with this kind of stuff is about the same as ever, because they never really were helping you if you had just very small amounts, because it was always on you to get the audience and to get yourself paid anyhow. But they're setting it up so that it is a kind of slide up into doing better for yourself. Get things to the situation where you can get paid on a regular basis, then jump on Patreon and see how that works. Because it's not that far off. It's just not trying to serve beginning creators anymore. Thanks. I think that's about all I have to say about that.